I'm reading from Coming to Jakarta, Part 3, Section 16. Strictly speaking, the only multinational financier I ever knew was Raleigh. Youngest child and gentlest father, and if I remember him once wearing a cutaway, it was only as a joke on himself at a Halloween party, or perhaps when I was 7 and married his daughter Elizabeth in a Lachute barn. No Marxist could have talked with Raleigh for 1 hour and still hated him, and yet it was Raleigh in his unsung job with an insignificant pension in the investment department of the Sun Life Assurance Company, Montreal's largest, who dealt with Curtis Calder of Havana Electric, Shanghai Power Company, and Italian Superpower. Raleigh, who, when we had tea in his small retirement apartment to talk about finance, had never heard of Meyer Lansky's racetrack leased to him by Citibank, where he corrupted the Cuban politicians, or of Du Yosheng's Green Gang, which Chiang and Tai Li used to wipe out the Shanghai communists and run the dope traffic. Raleigh and his department, who innocently as the Aswan engineers, not thinking about snails, helped persuade a reluctant General Motors to build a plant in South Africa so that the earnings from Sun Life's premiums could be invested in place and not create pressure on the Kruger Rand. In accordance with Plato, he kept to his station, as the best of us have done. 3:17. The Raja had expected his palace to be attacked from the south side, as martial custom would require, but unexpectedly the Dutch made for the north. His household, in a collective frenzy, half-dazed with opium, set the palace on fire, all his relatives dressed in their white finest, with gold ceremonial krisses, the women even more enthusiastic than the men, in short white loincloths covered with jewelry, their hair loose, carrying spears broken in half to be used at close range. The procession left the palace with the Raja at its head on a man's shoulders and protected by his gold umbrellas of state. Entranced women and boys marched up the avenue to the astonished Dutch, who gave orders to halt. But they only walked faster, then made an insane rush. The soldiers fired the first volley, and a few fell, but the frenzied men and women continued to attack. The soldiers, to avoid being overrun, were obliged to fire continually. Someone with a kriss went around killing the wounded. He was shot down, but an old woman took the kriss and continued the bloody task. The wives of the Raja stabbed themselves in a heap over his body. When the horrified soldiers stopped firing, the women threw gold coins, yelling that it was payment for a final shot, or else stabbed themselves. Everywhere, broken spears, krisses with gold handles, studded with diamonds and rubies, in pools of blood. A woman survivor who fainted when cut by the spear of a falling man told Covarrubias all she remembered was the cool hissing of the bullets, like music.
That was Peter Dale Scott, a former Canadian diplomat, UC Berkeley professor, and poet and political researcher, reading from his book-length poem, Coming to Jakarta. My name is Freeman Ng. I'm a former student, and we continue to read through the book and discuss it in this series of video podcasts.
We've actually ended a part today. There are 5 parts to the poem. This is the end of part 3.
Well, so we're beginning to enter into an area of the poem again that's going to require a lot of background explanations of historical, political figures and so forth. So let's start with Raleigh. Is he someone that we ought to know?
Yes, actually, we encountered him early on in the poem. He's the one who talked about the FFV, the First Families of Virginia at North Hatley. What's happening here at the end of part 3, in the section that comes just before, is the first time that I'm actually exercising power. I'm a consul in Warsaw, and I'm making all these young women cry, and I'm thinking about power from inside and not liking it, and decided not to be the consul. Here in section 16, I realized for the first time that my relationship to power wasn't just being a spectator of the Americans, the powerful Americans in North Hatley, that somebody he was actually my father's closest friend, and the Parkin family, Raleigh, Louise, and Elizabeth, were the closest family friends of the Scott family, my father, my mother, and myself, as exemplified by this fake marriage at the age of 7 when I, quote, married Elizabeth, and Raleigh dressed up in tails, a cutaway is a morning jacket, very fancy with a top hat. But that Raleigh, although to meet him he was very, as I say, gentle and not a dominating type of person, moved great amounts of money for his employers, the Sun Life Assurance Company, headquartered in Montreal, but selling life insurance all over the world. And he handled placing the investments in the countries where the premiums were paid for, so as I say at the end, not to create balance of payments problems for the country. So he was, in his own way, a small part of a huge system that was reinforcing American corporate capitalism throughout the world, just as I, in my small way, in Section 15, was laying down the Canadian law in Warsaw. And
he seemed less. He was not in a position to be as affected by the palpable results of his decisions, though, as you were.
Yeah, that's true. He was very much he doesn't see. He just moves things on paper. But I was quite surprised that he knew this man Curtis Calder that I had already written about. There was a company called American and Foreign Power. Excuse me. And they owned power companies all over the world, including in Cuba, where they were close to Batista and did a lot to fund the initial attempts to overthrow Castro before the CIA took it over. And they were also in Shanghai, and they were global, just like Sun Life was global. And Sun Life's investments handled by Raleigh were global. So, and the whole point of it is that Raleigh didn't really think about what it meant to, say, Cuba, for these premiums to be helping American and foreign power to become even more powerful in Havana and the rest of Cuba than it had been already. That's, I think, the reason that I wrote this.
He was just solving an accounting problem.
Yes, and a book balancing problem. But in a way, I put it in here because it helps to redefine. I had no idea when I grew up knowing Raleigh. I never saw him as part of the global economic system. But later, after I'd done my research, I decided to go and talk to him because, and it turned out that he knew at a very high level the people that I'd been writing about who were mostly American. And so it wasn't just a case of America doing something. Canada was implicit in what they did as well. And the whole of Part 3 is learning, as I said at the very beginning of Part 3, to see myself as part of the problem, not just witnessing it from outside. A little bit of sort of just a curious detail. Elizabeth, whom I married at the age of 7, grew up and married the son of Ezra Pound. So that, and I think maybe at one point I thought I was going to work that into the poem, but then it didn't really seem to be significant at a deep level of anything, so I didn't, but I thought I'd throw it in here.
Well, can you provide a little more information about some of these other situations you write about here? Meyer Lansky's racetrack? Yeah,
in Havana, the mob were well placed and were sort of enforcers to protect the American corporations. And they were well located because the National City Bank of New York owned the racetrack in Havana, and they leased it to Meyer Lansky. And this is very parallel to the situation that I'm talking about in the next passage about Du Yoshong's Green Gang, because there was a gang in Shanghai that ran the dope trade and was really, I think the people who originally made the deal with them was the Banque de l'Indochine, the Bank of Indochina, but it was very big in Shanghai as well as Indochina. And it was, when you have communists around, it's the reaction of a bank is to make an alliance with some kind of right-wing power, a local mafia. And there was a famous massacre in 1927 that André Malraux wrote a novel about man's fate, La Condition Humaine, which describes how the Green Gang and other Chiang Kai-shek, this is what really catapulted Chiang Kai-shek into leadership in China, was his successful alliance with the Green Gang, not just to defeat the communists, but to massacre them, which of course is very relevant to the main theme of the poem, which was the massacre of the communists in Indonesia. And so behind the massacre, it is described in the novel as being Chinese, but you have manipulators in Shanghai in the form of the American corporations and the Bank of Indochina. I think they all had their own deals with Du Yoshong. And it was, there wasn't a massacre of the same proportions in Havana, but there is a similarity to the relationship that the American corporations in Havana had to Meyer Lansky and to all of the mob figures who owned the casinos in Havana.
But Raleigh himself said that he was not aware of any of this.
Right, he would have had no idea.
Right.
And so that's
how did he feel when you told him about these things?
I wish I could say with authority, but you know, I had a more vivid memory of our talk when I wrote this, because I would have written it. It's possible I even had the talk in the course of editing, coming to Jakarta. I don't remember it very clearly now, but certainly he was not the kind of person who would accept massacre as being all in the day's work. It wasn't in his little compartmentalized kind of work. That's why I give the analogy of the Aswan engineers not thinking about snails. Egypt built this huge Aswan dam on the Nile, thinking, well, in order to provide power, a cheap source of power for the whole country, and also to control the flooding, which was until then an annual event in
Just
Egypt.
Solving an engineering problem in this case.
Right. But there were biological consequences, which is that it became an ideal water habitat for snails. And not only the Aswan area became infested with snails, but the whole of Egypt became infested with snails. And that makes me sound like I'm a complete conservative, maybe who don't want any change. No, I do want change, but change implemented category. It doesn't matter whether it's communist or capitalist. If it's not done ecologically with full considerations for the consequences, can be harmful.
You mentioned, you refer to General Motors plant in South Africa. What were the implications of that? What were the political implications of that decision?
Well, I have to speak for what I was thinking back then in the 1980s when I wrote this. I think it was the consolidation of corporate power in South Africa. South Africa was originally a rather agricultural country, the farmers, but I remember Raleigh stressing to me that General Motors hadn't wanted to build the plant, and that he, not personally, but he used not just Sun Life, but other people to persuade General Motors that it was in the idea, because otherwise the Krugerrand would have been a weak currency, because so much of it would have been going out of South Africa to the central headquarters in Montreal, and this way they were reinvested in South Africa, and it looks as if that makes South Africa stronger, but it has the consequence of developing more and more of a corporate overclass over and above the original inhabitants. I think that's what I had in mind. In accordance with Plato, he kept to his station. It's the best. He did his job. And Plato praises that. But the problem is, if we all just do our jobs, then in the end, forces are created which result in massacres.
Well, from this section, which gives us a little glimpse at the casualness of the planners of the places, of the sort of the inadvertent way that these decisions are made.
Right.
We go on to the next section, and even though it's separated by centuries, we get kind of a glimpse on the ground at at some of the consequences of these kinds of decisions.
Right. This is the way in which excuse me, the way in which the Netherlands finally conquered Bali in 1906. This was in the lifetime of my father, for example, and survivors of this whole episode was called a puputan, a mass suicide. It's interesting that Balinese has a word for mass ritual suicide, puputan. We don't know of very many, but there were actually two in the 20th century within 2 years of each other. This was the first one, the big one. And survivors talked about it to a man called Covarrubias, a painter who lived on the island later. And so we have a lot of very vivid description, perhaps not totally accurate, but certainly firsthand. And corroborated, I checked on Wikipedia, and this is roughly what happened. The Raja realized that he was defeated, and instead
before we go on, I wanted to clarify something.
Yeah.
This is the historical situation referred to earlier in the poem. Is that correct? This is the situation that the court poets.
No, it's
not
imbalanced. The court poets were talking about the very beginning of the Dutch occupation of Indonesia, and we're given their mythical account. And here is a very factual account of the very last stage of the Dutch occupation.
Okay.
The first one was in, I think, the 18th century. This is 1906, which, of course, may sound remote to younger viewers of this, but I was born in 1929. It was almost in my lifetime. And it was, the reaction was you can't defeat these people, so you just die in an appropriately formal way. And they came out armed with krisses and spears, not to attack the Dutch, but to kill themselves. And the sort of objective account under Puputan, P-U-P-U-T-A-N, in Wikipedia, says that the Dutch were watching and they just saw everyone start to kill themselves in front of them. And then somebody fired a shot by accident, and then things became more complicated. But it was a ritual suicide, and this tells us many things. It tells us that violence in the Third World, and perhaps particularly in this very controlled Balinese culture, that violence is not only an acceptable part of it, but at times what is expected, mass death.
It reminded me of the scene from the play, the shadow play, where the clown says, "Friend, I will kill myself."
Right,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It also suggests to me a culture that has been sort of psychically destroyed, that they've just been kind of crushed.
My version, I roughly agree. I'd say it's that you have the whole history of, after the Renaissance, was local cultures that governed themselves adequately and richly, and then could not cope with the forces of Western Europe. The big difference being that Western Europe had guns, cannons, they'd specialized in modern weaponry, and there was no answer for that. So you get something like this, that they stab themselves with their daggers because there's nothing they can do about the machine guns of the Dutch.
Well, on that depressing note, let's shall we go into our customary final reading?
Very good.
Maybe we could start with the soldiers to avoid being overrun, top 98.
The soldiers, to avoid being overrun, were obliged to fire continually. Someone with a kriss went around killing the wounded. He was shot down, but an old woman took the kriss and continued the bloody task. The wives of the Raja stabbed themselves in a heap over his body. When the horrified soldiers stopped firing, the women threw gold coins, yelling that it was payment for a final shot, or else stabbed themselves. Everywhere, broken spears, krisses with gold handles, studded with diamonds and rubies in pools of blood. A woman survivor who fainted when cut by the spear of a falling man told Covarrubias all she remembered was the cool hissing of the bullets like music.